Listen, something... I don't know how to explain it all. Just let me tell you what happened. Back on the 13th, me and Mark and Jody, we broke into Preston Park and things got really messed up. And I don't know what to do now. Have you ever heard of Preston Park? It was built back in the late 80s by Warren Preston III. He was one of those guys who was born into an obscene amount of cash. A family that had been rich for generations and just kept getting richer. Until Warren Preston III, anyway. Because he spent every dime of his whole family fortune and legacy building Preston Park, a family-friendly entertainment center meant to rival Walt Disney's creations. Constructed on a big plot of land just an hour outside of Vancouver. He came over from Europe, bringing his wife and daughter with him, and made a big deal about how Preston Park was going to be the premier destination for family-friendly fun. It was a massive project that took years to complete. They started construction in 1986, and for the first couple of years things were going okay, but then in 1988, Preston's second child was born, horribly deformed. Rumors circulated that it was from living around the plant's construction, all the fumes from the paints and the plastics. When the park was finally ready to open in 1991, his wife died. It was ruled a suicide. A few people went, but overall the park was a total failure. It stayed open for 1 year, during which Preston descended into drug-fueled paranoia. And that's not an exaggeration. His doctor wound up going to jail a few years after Preston left town. Turned out there was evidence that the doctor was dangerously jacking up all of his rich patients, including Preston, on amphetamines. People said that once the park was open, Preston could barely hold himself together. The death of his wife, the state of his second child, and I guess the drugs he was on. It was too much for him. He'd hold these press conferences for the park, where he'd wind up rambling about his fears of an oncoming nuclear war and wondering how humanity was supposed to survive going into such an apocalyptic future. In 1992, Preston announced that he was closing the park, and that was it. The park was shut down, and apparently Warren Preston III and his children left town, and they were never heard from again. But the place is still owned by his estate or something, so now it just sits there, abandoned and forgotten. It's not too difficult to get out to the place if you know where it is. There's a big fence around the property, but that's never stopped any real explorers, right? And it's pretty cool out there. You know, it's a decrepit amusement park. Broken down rides and cartoon murals with weathered paint partially worn off. Spooky as shit, sure. But I'd always heard this rumor that gets passed around amongst folks who are interested in that kind of stuff about how once, every 7 years, there's a way to get access to a secret staircase that leads into the bomb shelter Preston had built underneath the amusement park. The shelter was supposed to be a secret, but the thing was so big, word eventually got out about it. See, there's a door that's on a timer, so it only unlocks every 7 years when October 13th falls on a Friday, which you'll recall happened this month. The door is located up in the haunted house attraction of the park. It's this big old mansion that was built to look all spooky and be full of shadowy ghosts and stuff. But in one of the bedrooms upstairs, there's a closet. And if you go to the closet door on October 13th, when the 13th falls on a Friday, and knock 3 times, the door will open. And that reveals the staircase. The staircase that leads deep underground, under the subterranean guts of the park, and into the big bomb shelter that Preston had built. And the legend goes that there's miles of tunnels down there, running deep under the whole park. It's something he called the Garden. There's a handful of missing person cases connected to the place. Maybe a half dozen or so people over the years who told friends they were checking out the abandoned park and then were just never heard from again. Nothing anybody can prove. There's one girl who says she went down there and got some pictures, but they're just photos of long, dark hallways. They don't show much of anything. She said that she'd actually encountered another person down there who claimed they'd been living down there for years. But again, no proof. So of course, some people say that the original park owner went down there instead of actually leaving town. And then there's his kids who'd be in their 30s or 40s now. Like I said, a few people have gone down there and taken some photos, but it's largely gone unexplored just because it's so inconvenient to get into. Aside from the rumor about the one doorway and the stairs, the rest of the underground is locked up tight, under several feet of concrete, and behind some big iron doors that were sealed shut. So last Friday night, me and Mark and Jody drove out to Preston Park, and we went into the haunted house. And we went up into the bedroom on the 3rd floor, and we found the closet door, and we knocked 3 times, and it opened. And on the other side of the door there was a staircase leading down through the house and underground. Now, we were prepared for this. We had appropriate gear on, including hiking boots and gloves, and we had packs with flashlights, extra batteries, and enough food and water to last us for a few days. We were geared up, man, like military style. We were prepared to be down there for the weekend, if we could get away with it. The staircase wound deep down into the ground, at least 100 feet or so, and led us to a small hallway, which opened onto a long cement corridor that stretched off into the darkness in either direction. We had the option of going left or right. We flipped a coin and went left. We quickly realized that we'd been dropped down into the middle of a gargantuan labyrinth of long cement corridors. There was no consistency to the size and shape of the place. Some hallways were so narrow that we had to walk single file. Others could be up to 10 feet wide, I estimated. The ceilings mostly stayed around 7.5 feet high, which gave us all room to move, but we never forgot that we were in a confined space, deep underground. It was cold, but we were dressed for that, so it was fine. You keep moving, your body generates a fair amount of heat. The hallways twisted around, breaking into separate paths and reconnecting at what felt like random intervals. Every so often, we'd walk past doors that were built into the walls, large metal doors. Most of the doors were locked, but occasionally one would be open, always leading into a small room, sometimes with a cot, complete with a blanket and pillow, as well as what we eventually realized were small chemical toilets. Often there'd be boxes as well, which were usually full of preserved food rations and bottles of water, sometimes with little bundles of batteries, mostly AA and C-cell. The majority of the rooms appeared undisturbed. Only a few showed signs of having been visited before us. We'd been down there for a couple hours, just exploring, before we realized that we weren't alone. We were joking about it at first, but gradually, one by one, we each had to admit that we could legitimately hear something. Footsteps. And breathing. It was hard to be sure, there was so much echo in the place. We thought maybe the corridors were just playing tricks on us. But then the sounds got closer, and we knew we weren't imagining them. This thing we could hear, it sounded like an animal. Like a big animal. The way it breathed. I grew up around horses and cattle, and that's what it sounded like. Massive lungs drawing in huge amounts of air. We freaked out and started to run, until we came to an unlocked door with another little room with another little bed. So we hid in there, trying to not make any noise. And then we heard the footsteps getting closer. And that breathing. The footsteps came right up to the door. And then the knob started twisting. Something was trying to get in. We blocked the door and felt it starting to push in, and we pushed back with all of our strength, all three of us. And eventually the pushing stopped. And we heard the footsteps walk away. We waited there for about 20 minutes. Nobody spoke. Then we slipped out into the hallway and had a little argument about what to do next. Mark wanted to go back, but Jody and I, we voted to push forward. Maybe that seems stupid now, but at the time, it seemed like a worse idea to backtrack over where we'd already been. And Mark didn't want to go back alone, so he stayed with us. I feel really bad about that now. A little while after that, we ran into Michelle. I knew about Michelle from the research we'd done before going down. She was one of the people who'd gone missing back in the mid-90s. That meant she'd been down there for around 20 years. I barely recognized her from her photographs. Her hair was short and gray, and it looked like she cut it with a knife. Her skin was frighteningly pale, and her eyes seemed too big for her face. Her clothing was ragged and stained. She had a flashlight of her own, and it seemed to work okay, so I guess she was using the batteries from the boxes we'd found. She asked us what year it was, and when we told her, she didn't believe us. We showed her our phones and the dates on them, and she just laughed. We asked her why she'd never come back up. She said she didn't need to. She said there was enough canned food to feed 100 people for decades. There was shelter, toilets, even batteries for her flashlight, and miles of tunnels. Michelle told us that there were so many more tunnels than anybody knew. She said she'd mapped out part of it in her first few years and then just gave up. And she said the monster wouldn't let her leave. If she tried to escape, it would know, so she had to stay hidden. Michelle told us that there was evidence which suggested that Warren Preston had discovered a series of naturally occurring caves and tunnels underground and had them lined with cement and converted into corridors so as to add them to his sprawling maze of a bomb shelter, the garden. Michelle told us that we weren't alone down there. She said that the Prestons had all moved down there, the father and his 2 children. The father had died a while back, but the 2 kids, now adults, were still alive. And there were a few others who'd found the place over the years and were surviving like she was. We tried to get Michelle to tell us how many other people were down there, or to talk about whatever we'd heard moving around, or the monster she was so scared of. But the questions made her uncomfortable, and she stopped talking for a while. I don't think she was that used to too much human contact, really. We kept going, and for a while Michelle stayed with us. I could tell she was conflicted, that she felt safer alone, but she was clearly so lonely that she'd started to lose her mind a little. Or maybe more than a little. There was strange graffiti on some of the walls. Very primal. Just basic shapes and patterns of handprints. Not really any words. Just symbols and sometimes outlines of shapes. Some human, others less easy to identify. Maybe it was random, but it didn't feel like it to me. It felt like a story was being told, and I just didn't have the tools to translate it. I could see there was a message, but I couldn't see what the message was. We'd been walking with Michelle for a couple hours, and then we heard it again. The footsteps, the breathing. It was off in the distance, but we could all hear it, whatever it was. And that's when Michelle left us. She just turned off her flashlight and ran away into the dark. We chased after her, but the corridor split up and curved into 2 different directions. We didn't want to separate, so the 3 of us took one path, and eventually it reconnected with the other one. And that was where we found Michelle. That was where we found her body. I'd never seen a dead body before. When our flashlights found her in the dark, I screamed. I think we all did. We were freaking out. It was horrible. She'd been torn apart. It looked like something had ripped her insides out and spread them across the floor. And we could still hear that thing moving around us. So we started running. We were panicking. We didn't know what we were doing, where we were going. And then a door opened, with a light coming from inside the room. So we ran into the room. A woman slammed the door behind us. She had wild black hair and hard little eyes. That same frighteningly pale skin that Michelle had. She looked healthier than Michelle, though, and seemed significantly more sane. She said her name was Diana, and that she'd been living down in the tunnels for almost all of her life. We asked her what that thing was that was following us around. Diana said it was her brother. This was Diana Preston, the older of Warren Preston's 2 children. She told us she'd been down there with her brother since the park closed. It was originally just her and her brother and her father, but then her father died and the 2 siblings had been left alone. We asked her why she didn't come up, why she lived down there in the dark. She told us that she couldn't leave, that it had to be this way. That's the way it had always been, that's the way it would always be. The place we were in was the garden, and the garden had a monster, and the monster had a keeper. And then she told us this story, like a fable, but not really, about how once upon a time there was a beautiful garden built by a kind old king. And the garden was built to be the safest place in the whole world. On the outside, it had a great wall, so it was almost impossible to enter. And on the inside, there was a monster who lived there to keep the garden safe. And along with the monster, there was a brave warrior who was there to keep the monster from leaving the garden. Their fates were bound together. The monster, the keeper, and the garden. The garden needed a monster, and the monster needed a keeper, and so they lived forever. We asked why her brother was trying to hurt us, and she wouldn't answer. She just said we should get moving. So we kept moving. She led us forward. Diana knew all the secrets of the garden. She could open all the doors and didn't even seem to need the flashlight she carried. Mark and Jody and I said that it didn't seem fair that Diana and her brother had to stay below. But she said it had always been that way, and it was how things had to be. She kept repeating that bit from the story. The garden needed a monster, and the monster needed a keeper. It was like a mantra to her. As we walked, Diana told us rambling little stories about her parents. How her father had been obsessed with the idea of enhancing children while they were still in the womb. Diana said that when her mother had been pregnant with her, her father had fed her mother loads of weird vitamins and steroids. And Diana said that he put the woman's body through other processes that were meant to strengthen the baby that was inside of her. Experimental processes. Diana said that because she'd been born healthy, her father had basically doubled the amount of shit he'd pumped into his wife's body when she was pregnant with their second child. And that was why Diana's younger brother had been born the way he was. She said her brother's bones were too big, too heavy, resulting in strange deformities, especially of his face. It also accounted for his size. Diana said her brother was immense, possibly the largest man ever. Out in the real world, she said, he'd tower over other men. She said his muscles were like swollen tumors trying to force their way out through his thick, leathery skin. Diana said they'd never named him. He was just her brother. Jody asked Diana about her father, if he was still alive, and for a moment we weren't sure Diana was going to answer the question. But then she said, very softly, "The monster got him." "What does it want?" Jody asked. And Diana said, "It doesn't want anything. It just kills. It kills because it likes to, because that's what's wrong with it. It's a monster. Monsters hunt. Monsters kill. Monsters take pleasure in the fear and pain of others. That's what it likes." "And what about the keeper?" Jody asked. Diana said, "The keeper has magical armor to stay safe. The keeper is a noble soul, locked in armor, sworn to a task." "You could leave with us," Jody said. And Diana turned and shouted, "Locked in armor, sworn to a task." We didn't talk much for a while after that. Eventually we heard the sounds again. The footsteps, the breathing, the massive body moving in the dark. Diana said she wanted to go try to deal with her brother and sent us on along without her. We didn't know where we were going. We wanted to find our way back to the stairs, but we couldn't just go back the way we came. So we pushed on. We walked for miles. It was all the same. Twisting gray-black corridors, broken up every few hundred yards by large metal doors which would lead to rooms where every so often we'd find more boxes of survival rations and a few different types of batteries. There were crates of the stuff in some rooms. Like Michelle had said, enough to last for years. Time started to go by. Since we were able to find food, we didn't have to dig into our own supplies, which we held on to just in case. And we used the chemical toilets down there as well, so we didn't just have to piss and shit in the hallways. But you get what I'm saying, right? We were lost down there, in the dark. We had to turn off our phones since we couldn't recharge them, not like we could get a signal anyways, unsurprisingly. But time was going by, and we were beyond just getting scared. We'd found a dead, dismembered body, and a weird woman had told us a story about illegal experimentation. And now hours were turning into days. We had to stop to rest and wound up falling asleep, mostly in shifts. One or two of us would nap for a bit, and the other would keep watch. After a while, Joni and I started using the cots that we found in some of the rooms. Mark wouldn't. We were terrified. I learned stuff about those guys down there. Personal stuff. Stuff we would have never admitted to another human being. We got sick of each other too, trapped with each other down there in the dark, blaming each other, hating each other. There were points when we'd walk without talking at all, but somehow that was even worse. And then, I don't know when this was, but we came to a long, deep room. It was about the size of a high school gym and full of a bunch of big, heavy boxes. God only knows what was inside them. We walked into the room and heard something moving around at the far end, but it wasn't big and heavy like whatever had been chasing us. It was regular-sized, like a person. So we pointed our lights at it, and it turned out to be this wild-looking guy. Big gray beard and crazy long hair. I guess he was one of the others who'd gone missing. But in the end, I don't know who he was or why he was down there. So we lit him up with our flashlights, and he starts to freak out, moaning and looking around, and we're like, buddy, it's cool, it's all good. And then he pulls out this little handgun, and he starts pointing it at us, screaming at us to stay back. And we're like, hey man, nobody wants to hurt you, you're fine. And then we all stop, because we can hear the sound of something coming towards us. Something very large, something very heavy, and it doesn't sound far away. It sounds close. It sounds like it's found us. I looked around the room and noticed in one corner a bunch of mattresses and blankets heaped up in a big pile like a nest. And then I looked at the walls and I saw all the markings, handprints and abstract shapes. But they were all made so large. The hands that made them had to be enormous and attached to a massive body. And I remember turning to Mark and Jody and saying, "Oh God, this is where it lives." And then it was there, in the room with us. Mark and I shut off our flashlights, but Jody dropped hers and it went rolling across the floor. I never saw him properly. I just got a sense of his scale, his mass. He had to be at least 5 feet across at the shoulders. It was surreal. And the face was... He didn't look human. He looked... But while I was looking over at him, at Diana's brother, Mark ran over and tackled the guy with the gun. For a moment I could hear them wrestling in the dark, and then I heard the gun hit the floor, and I guess Mark picked it up. And then Mark shot the thing. The monster. The deformed boy who'd never been named. From across the room, Mark shot it in the face, and it crumpled to the floor. We turned our flashlights back on, and I asked Mark if it was dead. Mark said he wasn't sure, and the crazy guy with the beard, he started screaming wildly at us, asking us what we'd done. "It's cool," I said. "We stopped the monster." And then he starts calling us idiots, and he says, "That's not the monster." He says, "That's the only thing keeping us safe from the monster." That's when Diana walked in through the same door her brother had come through. And the guy with the beard started screaming this high-pitched wail. And Diana stepped over her brother, and she ignored us and walked straight up to the guy with the beard. And she fucking killed him. She pulled out a pair of knives and stuck them into his belly and opened him up onto the floor. And then she started laughing and looking over at us. So we took off running, back the way we'd come. We'd been running in total darkness, I think for a few hours, when I realized that Mark was gone. One moment we were running right next to each other, and then I heard him stumble, and I flashed my light on to look back where he'd been, but there was nothing there. No body, no sign of a struggle. He was just gone. Jody and I kept moving. Sometimes with our lights on, mostly in the dark. We could hear her behind us. Diana. The monster. And we'd killed the only thing that could have protected us from her. It was like that for I don't know how long. Hours. Days. Diana would disappear into the dark, and then out of nowhere we'd hear her footsteps or a little laugh. And then I was all alone. I'd made it, somehow, back to where we'd started. But I was alone. I don't know when Jody disappeared. We were being so quiet. Maybe she abandoned me. I don't know. I really don't. But I'd made it back to the first corridor we'd been in, the one that led past the hall which connected to the stairs. And that's when she came for me. She stopped trying to hide. She stopped hunting. She let me see her. She let me see the big long knives that she carried. She let me see the cold, dead glee in her eyes. She wanted me to know how much she enjoyed it. My fear. My helplessness. She got up close so I could see her properly, so I could see her eyes. And then she stopped. She just stood there, so close I could have reached out and touched her, and she stared at me. Not even at me. Past me. And then I heard the sound of breathing. Like an animal. Breathing. And I felt a warm breath on the back of my neck. It was behind me. The creature. the monster, Diana's little brother. I could feel him, immense and heavy, looming over me. Diana laughed, and then turned and walked away. As soon as she was out of sight, I ran up the stairs. I didn't look back. The stairs took me back up into the house, and then I ran all the way out, through the park, back through the hole in the fence. So, I don't know what to even do now. Do I call the cops? Do I report Mark and Jody as missing? Do I tell them what I saw? I feel like I should just get out of town. What do you think? What should I do?